religion works line upon line, so does science. They both work that way. And the problem has been that there are people who look at scripture and say, well, this is the absolute truth, so science has to bend. And then you also have people who are saying, well, science is the absolute truth, so scripture has to bend.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Saints Unscripted. Cam and I are here with the illustrious Ben Spackman once again. Welcome.
Thank you.
You guys know Ben. We've had him on before. If you haven't seen his other episodes, go check him out. They were pretty controversial.
It gets views.
That's why we bring you on.
Generates comments.
Yeah. And today's topic is also, okay, maybe not like top tier importance, but very interesting. People have questions about it. Dinosaurs.
Yes.
So maybe outline for us why Latter-day Saints are interested in this topic, what maybe the common questions or controversy is, and then we're just going to let you take it away.
So just about everyone's been to a natural history museum. They've seen, the bones recreated, they're 4 stories tall, or they have a 3-year-old who can do more Latin names of dinosaurs than you can of, current makes of cars or whatever. And at some point, everyone says, well, hold on, how do these fit into the theological structure that we have with Adam and Eve and the fall and all of that stuff? And that still gets asked a lot by missionaries, by seminary teachers, by various people. And I did, this relates to my research on creation and the flood and how we interpret scripture and all of that stuff. So I did a presentation at the Mormon History Association a couple years ago on this.
On dinosaurs?
On the history of dinosaurs. How Latter-day Saints have made sense of dinosaurs.
Living the dream.
Yeah. It was not well attended, I'll tell you. I can't compete with things like polygamy, but people still ask these questions a lot, and there's not a ton of great material out there that's kind of looking at how we've made sense of it. And the bottom line is there are really about 4 ways we've made sense of it in the church in, 200 years. So when I was a missionary, I read Mormon Doctrine cover to cover.
Okay. Like a novel.
Well, it wasn't that long.
It's like an encyclopedia.
And it was like an encyclopedia. I was like, I'm learning all this stuff, right? And there's a very short entry under the heading dragons. And I got to dragons, and it said, I don't remember if it said more than this, but it said, dragons may represent memories of the pre-flood dinosaurs. And that was it. I went, what? You can't
refuses
just
to elaborate.
Just where? Come on.
Was there a scripture citation?
Nope, there was nothing.
Okay.
And of course, I've since come to learn that Elder McConkie followed Joseph Fielding Smith, who was following Seventh-day Adventist George McCready Price, who was following an early 1800 groups called the Mosaic Geologists, where they believed that Scripture required the earth to be very young. And so what did you do with all this stuff that looked very old? Well, obviously, it couldn't be old. So where did they go? Dinosaurs, cavemen, fossils, whatever. And this is called flood geology. And it was really, really fringy among Christians in the United States until 1961. And then it exploded. And now it's, tens and tens of millions of people in the United States think the earth is young. And things like dinosaur fossils were created by Noah's flood about 3000 BC.
Created by. How does
Well, in the sense
work?
of dinosaurs coexisted with humans up until the flood, and then the flood killed them all.
Okay, so the flood was the catastrophic event that wiped out the dinosaurs. Okay.
Yep. And all of those things that look human, those were all killed in the flood too. That is what generated all the fossils, made the Grand Canyon and things like that.
I'm sure you'll get to this, but where's the evidence for that?
The big thing today is Answers in Genesis. That's the big Young Earth Creation Ministry. They have the Ark Encounter in Kentucky, the life-size, that's Ken Ham. Ham. And they have the Creation Museum where you can go and you can see like humans riding on dinosaurs and things like that. This is, of course, highly contested or just ignored by mainstream scientists because it's being driven by interpretations of Scripture They're saying, well, Scripture is giving us the truth. We've got to fit science to that.
Just picturing Moses riding into Egypt on a velociraptor now.
With lasers, no doubt, because lost technologies and things, right?
Oh, there's such a big part of me that wants. I want to believe. That would be so cool.
Yeah. And this is actually a good bit of my dissertation deals with this because it was Joseph Fielding Smith's adoption of flood geology through Seventh-day Adventists that became really influential in the church after 1954. And if you go pick up the Old Testament Institute Manual, Volume 1 from 1980, you can find a 2,000-word quotation from a Seventh-day Adventist creationism pamphlet attacking evolution and dating methods and things like that. Because the guy who wrote that section was completely into young earth creationism, Seventh-day Adventist stuff, and Correlation looked at it and said, yeah, this is all fine. Because they too had been heavily influenced by this stuff.
Yeah.
So that's the young earth flood geology. They all died in the flood, things like that. That's Joseph Fielding Smith. That's Mormon Doctrine and Bruce R. McConkie. And I think that's a relatively minor position in the church today, but it's had a lot of inertia behind it at certain points. So there are two questions that tend to come up with them. One is, well, if the point of the ark was to preserve all the animals, how come God was like, all you cool animals, there's no room for you, right? How come those animals weren't worth saving? And the other one is, if all the diversity of life we see is developed since 3000 BC, how did they fit so many variants on the ark? And the answer that they have today, which is really ironic, but it shows how much assumptions drive conclusions, is Noah only took a representative type of each on the ark. And when they came off the ark, there has been heavily accelerated evolution since then to produce the diversity of species we see.
So he brought the chicken and he brought the alligator and called it good.
Or, brought a dog. And then we got, the Shih Tzu, but we also got wolves.
Right.
Somehow in the few thousand years since then.
Okay.
Sorry, dinosaurs. You
didn't make the cut.
No room.
Make the cut.
Okay, so that's one theory.
So that's one. Still very prominent. Still very mainstream in America. There's a second young earth version that says, and this is much more among Latter-day Saints, that says, well, creation is really young. Things haven't been like this for more than a few thousand years, but they look old because the pieces are old. That is, God created the earth kind of like, when your brother comes in and smashes your Lego models that you've made, if you took chunks from them and just kind of Frankensteined them together, right? That's how God created the earth.
Just pieces and parts of other previous planets.
So
that was the seminary lesson I got.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
The fossils we find, they're legitimately old. The radioactive stuff, the radioactive dating that we use, that's all legitimately old because it is old. But creation really just happened a few thousand years ago. And this goes back to something that Joseph Smith is reputed to have said and then was widely misunderstood. So I've got it here. This is from the William Clayton Journal. This Earth was organized or formed out of other planets which were broke up and remodeled and made into the one on which we live. However Joseph Smith said this, I don't think William Clayton's making stuff up, but we actually have texts from geologists in the 1800s where they are saying similar things. But starting in the late 1800s, early 1900s, a couple of Latter-day Saints who were trying to make sense of fossils and things said, well, Joseph Smith said this, and that can kind of explain it.
So what's the problem with that theory?
The problem with that is it doesn't seem to be quite what Joseph Smith meant. And as has been pointed out by people like James E. Talmage, who was a geologist and an apostle, and John Whitsoe, who was a chemist and an apostle, and Henry Eyring Sr., who trained as a geologist before he became a chemist, they've all looked at it and said, this is not really compatible with what the geology and paleontology says. Henry Eyring had this great phrase where he said, it would take a very clever shovel to lay all of these things down in the consistent pattern we find them in. So it's not random. It doesn't fit the fragmentary hypothesis. It also doesn't fit the the flood killed them all and put them in these neat layers. But because it got popularized, it still floats around. People still hear it in seminary. And there was an article in the BYU Journal for seminary and institute teachers called Religious Educator about 2 or 3 years ago by a retired BYU Idaho scientist named Trent Stevens, where he addresses this directly in all of the church history stuff. Was the Earth formed from the debris of other planets? And he says, it's not what the science says. That's not what Joseph Smith says. And this has been shot down for over a century by high-ranking LDS apostles, so can we please put it to bed? But I suspect it will keep circulating.
Yeah.
If that quote was attributed to Joseph Smith, what do you think the actual interpretation?
I think he was probably thinking more in terms of element, in terms of fundamental matter, not chunks.
Yeah, kind of stating something against creation ex nihilo.
Yeah, probably. Yeah.
So we've got the flood theory.
Flood geology.
We've got the pieces and parts theory. Yeah. What's the next one?
Next one is at least old Earth. It's very clear from a lot of things, like geology, like the layers, that the Earth has been around for more than a few thousand years, right? And B.H. Roberts kind of plays into this one too. This is, among other Christians, this is called gap theory. And the reason for this is because, as it goes, what you do is you read Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. God creates. And they say God created this entire creation. There was civilization, there were people, there were animals. And then they read verse 2 as it became formless and void. That is, it became evil. It fell. Satan influenced it. And it became so bad that God destroyed it, like he does with the flood, right? And then there's a gap of maybe millions and millions of years between those first verses. And so when God creates in 7 days, they say that's literal. That's really what God did, but it was a recreation. And so when we find fossils and things, those all belong to one of those earlier creations on this earth, this planet, but millions and millions of years ago. So the dating is fine. We don't have problems with that. But God created Adam and Eve, out of the clay and breathed life into them, and all of that is recent. So this is sometimes called gap theory because of the supposed gap in Genesis, which doesn't work in Hebrew at all, by the way. Very problematic. It's sometimes called ruin and restoration theory because there was this civilization and life and everything that then went to ruin, and God restored it with this new creation in Genesis chapter 1.
Can we call it the first draft theory? Just like tried it out, didn't work out.
Something went wrong.
Erase.
It was half cooked.
Let's start again.
Gap theory has been around since the early 1800s. Got started in England, was a very popular way of reconciling old Earth, fossils, dinosaurs with what the Bible says.
What was the prevailing theory in the 1800s? Prior to all of these
it was probably either kind of young Earth or gap, but it wasn't really controversial because today pretty much everyone is aware that there is a gap, at least popularly, between what science says and what religion says. Now, both of those are really problematic because neither of them really say what people think they say, and so the controversy, the conflict is kind of artificial. But if you go back to, the 1600s or the 1200s or the 500s, no one cares about the age of the Earth. If you're living in Jerusalem in 300 AD, and I ask you, how old is the Earth? What resources do you have to turn to answer that completely bizarre and irrelevant question? There's nothing scientific. There's various Greek philosophies. There's various old texts.
And at that point, you're probably more concerned about not dying.
Yeah.
The plague.
Yeah.
Science was, it wasn't a professional thing. It wasn't a technical thing. It wasn't something you got trained for. All of that changes in the 1800s. And science is now technical, specialized, professional, highly mathematical, highly regulated. You have to be qualified. You have to be credentialed. And in the late 1800s, you get two guys in America who really popularize what's come to be called the conflict hypothesis or the warfare hypothesis. And what this says...
Is this the fourth one?
No.
Okay.
No, this is background information that shapes how everyone in America thinks today, but is a complete misunderstanding.
Okay.
What these two guys said was science is a fixed idea. You can go back 2,000 years and science is the same kind of thing. And religion is fixed. You can go back thousands of years and it's the same kind of thing. And they are eternally and inevitably at war with each other. They had their own reasons for doing this. One of these guys was the first president of Cornell University. And Cornell in the 1800s was the first university to be founded without the backing of a large religious group. Because historically, universities were meant for training priests, and that meant biblical languages, but it also meant philosophy, it meant mathematics, it meant music. And so colleges and universities were deeply religious places, even up until the 1960s. Like I think at Princeton, you were still required to attend chapel up through 1962. Mm-hmm. And then universities have secularized incredibly quickly. But in making Cornell this first university not backed by a religious group, he took the perspective that science can now operate untrammeled. We won't have priests giving us dogma. We can explore freely because the Catholic Church has been holding truth back for centuries. And so he plays on anti-Catholicism in America. He plays on this new professionalization of science that's going on as it's becoming like the main way of knowing things.
And he pits the two against
each other. Yeah. And this is super common today. This is what people grow up with, right? Science and religion, they're in conflict. What are you going to do about it?
I only believe in science.
Yeah.
We see it in movies today. So we were talking about the gap theory.
Yeah.
You mentioned that it doesn't work out with the Hebrew. Is that the biggest obstacle for it?
It also doesn't work great with the science. Like I said, it got started in the 1800s as a way of reconciling science and religion before they really got too bad. And then in 1961, there's a book that gets published called The Genesis Flood by two evangelicals who completely plagiarize Seventh-day Adventist George McCready Price. Mm. And they strip out all the Adventism from it and add in a bunch more modern science. And this thing sells like hotcakes. Mm. They'd been rejected by so many publishers, including evangelical publishers and conservative publishers. So they had to find this podunk publisher to sell this controversial, stupid book that they thought no one would want. And it sells like crazy, and it completely replaces gap theory as the dominant way of reconciling.
And this is when?
1961 is when that gets published. And by the way, BYU deans of religion get a copy of that maybe before it's published. The date's not clear. And they are huge fans.
And is this leading into the fourth theory that you were talking about?
Well, that's actually getting into part of how did creationism spread so fast among Latter-day Saints and into the Institute Manual and all of that stuff. And part of it is the people at BYU weren't trained in science. They also weren't trained in biblical studies or anything else. And they had been primed by Joseph Fielding Smith pushing all this stuff so that when the Genesis flood came out, they looked at it and went, "Oh, this is great. This is solid science that just supports scripture." And they talk about integrating it into the curriculum. And the guy who's in charge of seminary a couple of years later takes another book by them, sends it out to every seminary and institute as like, here's a great book you all need to read. And the reality was it was all based on these assumptions about the nature of scripture promulgated by a Seventh-day Adventist that was then plagiarized. So that's all of that is side to gap theory.
Okay.
So then we come to mainstream science, basically, that says there's an old Earth, these dinosaurs, these humanoids, these animals that no longer exist, lived here over millions and millions and millions of years. And, dinosaurs probably died out when this massive asteroid hit and kind of threw all kinds of stuff in the air, and evolution happened. And What's interesting is that there has been very high-level support for this kind of thing in the church pretty much since the science was there in the early 1900s. In 1906, there's a Latter-day Saint at Columbia named Frederick Pack who gets his PhD in geology and paleontology. In 1911, the First Presidency creates a standing committee of a couple apostles and the Church Commissioner of Education and two guys named Talmage and Whitsoe who aren't apostles yet but are scientists. And they assign this committee, pay attention to this Frederick Pack guy, because he is doing really interesting work harmonizing scripture and science and evolution, and we want to encourage him. First Presidency, 1911, encouraging straight evolutionary old earth science from a Latter-day Saint. They put him into the General Sunday School Board. They put him on the radio speaking for the church. They publish one of his books. They send out his material in pamphlets, and it's all old earth, death happening for a long time, evolution. Brings us up to James E. Talmage in 1931. There had been some controversy over B.H. Roberts' book, and Joseph Fielding Smith had given a public talk that was very, Scripture requires us to be young earth. Scripture requires us to throw out evolution. There were no pre-Adamites. There was no death before the fall. We don't care what the scientists say, because Scripture is true. And this generates all kinds of internal controversy. And ultimately, what the First Presidency decides is, we don't have positions on this. We have no position on death before the fall. We have no position on pre-Adamites. They reject Smith's paradigm. You can't get science out of Scripture that way. But they also think we need public balance. Because at this time, you're a couple years off the Scopes trial about evolution. Science is really becoming a thing in the 1920s and 30s, right? And here you have this high-ranking church apostle, the grandnephew of the prophet Joseph Smith himself, who's out there in public saying, we don't care what science says. Well, the church commissioner had done a poll, and the number 3 concern of the youth at that time was the relationship between science and Scripture. So the First Presidency is concerned that people are going to come away from Smith's talk going, we don't care about science. Science is false. And so they have Talmage give this public talk in the tabernacle called Earth and Man. He's an apostle. He has a PhD in geology. He's speaking from the tabernacle, and he says, the earth is millions of years old. Clearly, things have lived and died for millions of years. He doesn't go for evolution because he doesn't believe in it. He doesn't think the science is there. He basically takes a very old earth, no gap theory, no young earth. We don't know how all this fits together, but the science is very solid. And the church publishes this as a pamphlet. And it sells 10, 20, 30,000 copies all over the United States. They publish it in the Deseret News. They publish it in the British Latter-day Saint magazine. They translate it into German and publish it for German Latter-day Saints. This thing gets massive First Presidency sponsored distribution.
Wow.
That is old earth, straight science, can't get science out of Scripture the way Joseph Fielding Smith wanted to, is the subtext. Skip forward 40 years. In 1987, the church goes to a BYU geology professor who I think might have been dean. I can't remember. Morris Peterson. He's also a stake president. So he has, a certain degree of ecclesiastical authority and respectability, and has been vetted by the church half a dozen ways because of both his job and his calling. And they say, will you write us an article about the earth and fossils and things? So he writes up this article, and it gets passed around the church office building and read by everyone multiple times to get vetted, to get cleared. And then it gets printed in the Ensign in September of 1987 with virtually no changes. And what he says is, the science is very clear that the earth is old. Things have been living and dying for a long time on this earth. They're part of this creation. He doesn't say anything about evolution. That's not technically his field. But it basically says everything is exactly what it looks like. They didn't die in the flood, none of that stuff. That's an implicit rebuke to those other ideas that have floated around. And then come up to 2016. You get an article in the New Era called What Does the Church Teach About Dinosaurs? Which echoes Peterson, which echoes Talmage, which echoes Pack. It says these things have lived and died on the earth for millions of years.
It's like 2 paragraphs, isn't it?
Yeah, it's not
super
very
short.
long. And there's a similar one around the same time. What does the church teach about evolution? That says we don't have a position on evolution. It's clear things have been living and dying for a long time. The good thing is, from my perspective, if you look at official church materials in the history, the church is very solidly aligned with the best mainstream, documentable, publishable science that exists.
That's good news.
I think so.
There shouldn't be
I think so.
much controversy.
But prophets and apostles have also been very clear that God inspires scientific research, scientific discovery. There are some really great quotes from President Nelson, and you can go back. There's a fun one from Hugh B. Brown, who was one of the counselors to President McKay, where he says, revelation may come out of prayer and out of scripture, but it also may come out of the laboratory in the test tube.
That's cool.
It seems to me that we have fairly overwhelming scientific information that shows an old Earth, that shows dinosaurs and Cro-Magnon and whoever lived and died millions of years, and that they're connected via evolution. We have scriptural information that has been interpreted certain ways. As I've pointed out, Joseph Fielding Smith and some others read it very differently than some others. And I suspect that our scriptural information is not quite what we have thought it is. We have often read it as just providing divine facts of science, as if Genesis or 2nd Nephi or D&C 77 is like God's Wikipedia, right? These are just the facts that are there in God's encyclopedia, and so science has to conform to that. We've talked before about various principles of revelation and the nature of Scripture and things like that. We have to look at our own traditions as well as questioning science, because science is not a fixed thing. Science is always turning up more data, and the way scientific paradigms work is when you have enough data that doesn't fit into the current paradigm, at some point someone comes up with a newer paradigm that accounts for that. And Henry Eyring, Sr., got roped into a lot of these science-religion debates. He was actually President Kimball's brother-in-law. So he was consulted sometimes on these kinds of questions, especially because he'd been in geology, he'd been in chemistry. And he said, look, religion works line upon line. So does science. They both work that way. And the problem has been that there are people who look at Scripture and say, well, this is the absolute truth, so science has to bend. And then you also have people who are saying, well, science is the absolute truth, so Scripture has to bend. We're just going to throw out Scripture because science is this. And he says both of those are wrong. They're both working on the same paradigm of line upon line. And so we have to be just as self-critical of our own assumptions and tradition and how we've interpreted and understood Scripture as we are of carbon dating or things like that. Whatever it is has to be solidly based, has to be aware of its own assumptions. And we haven't always done a good job of that in the church with Scripture. I think we're in a really interesting period where we are doing that. We're at a place where we feel secure enough and established enough as a church, mature enough, that we can now look back on things like, this is not helping me here, but we can look at our own history and say, you know what, we had this tradition, that tradition was not well-founded, and so we're going to get rid of it. It wasn't revelatory. It wasn't based on good things. We thought it was, but it really wasn't. I think we're doing that with saints. I think we're doing that with the gospel topics discussions that cover uncomfortable and controversial positions, polygamy, the Book of Abraham, the priesthood ban. In some ways, these are things that raise more questions than they answer, but they're really important to think about.
Yeah. And we're doing that here.
We're trying.
We're talking about it right now.
Yeah.
And we're living in a time when we can pretty comfortably do that. Thank you for being with us today.
Hey, thanks for having me.
That was fantastic. If people have questions for you, where can they go?
BenSpackman.com.
Okay, great.
We're not about all of this stuff there.
We're not going to belabor it. We're just going to end because you guys have plenty of stuff to watch after that. That was amazing. Thank you so much. Dinosaurs.